So in this third part of the lecture, I want to talk specifically about innovation strategy. So talking here about the strategies that we might look at developing that will drive and grow innovation within an organisation. So like any part of strategy, innovation and strategic innovation needs to be managed in a focused and controlled manner. There's a tendency to believe that innovative and entrepreneurial behaviours can just be left to chance or to organic processes. But there is a need, particularly in an existing organisational context, for these things to be driven and to be championed. Okay, so it's really important that as an organisation there is a management process that sits around the management of innovation. And when we think about an innovation strategy, we're really talking about 4 levels of work that need to happen for an innovation strategy to occur. So we have this sort of high-level holistic strategy, the overarching strategy about where do we want to go as an organisation. We need to think about the innovation portfolio that we're going to try and build, because we don't just want to do one innovation and that's it, leave it. We want to have a series of innovations that come over time and to be very clear about the resources that we're going to dedicate to driving those innovations over a period of time. We need to think about the strategy at the level of the individual project. Okay, so we need to think about an individual strategy for each innovation that we're trying to drive within the organisation. And we need to think about the innovation culture and behaviours that we're trying to build within the organisation and how those can shape and direct overall innovation behaviour within the organisation. And this figure here just summarises that approach for us. So we need to be building an integrated strategy, a holistic strategy that operates on all 4 levels. So we have the overall innovation strategy, the broad picture of where we want to go in terms of driving innovation as an organisation. We need to think about the portfolio of innovations that we're going to have, what sort of activities are we going to be doing. We need to think about each individual project and the strategies we have for those, so in terms of the resources we're going to apply, the people who will be in charge of and driving those innovations, the people who will be managing the organisational context. And we need to think about the culture and behaviours that we're trying to shape within the organisation and how these will manage and drive innovation in the future. So with that in mind, the text talks about some core principles of any effective innovation strategy, and I want to run through those principles and just talk to each of them individually. The text does do a pretty good job of explaining each of these in a bit more detail, so I would encourage you to actually go and read the section on the core principles of innovation and be mindful of how you might build these things into an innovation strategy. So the first thing, and it goes back to those 4 levels of strategy we were talking about, is that an overall innovation strategy must be developed. Okay, so there has to be a whole of organisation strategy about how we're going to drive innovative behaviour in the future. So why does it need to happen at the whole of organisational level? The job of the senior management of the organisation is to decide how their limited resources are going to be allocated across different competing activities within an organisation. And so it's very important that our business has a clear picture of what it is we're trying to do in each of those different sectors, each of those different industries, and how we might drive innovation in each of those different sectors. If you think back to the BCG matrix we talked about a little while ago, the BCG matrix tells us that we need a portfolio of businesses and that we need to be managing that portfolio in an integrated way. And so by having this overarching innovation strategy, we're able to think about how we drive innovation in those different parts of the business. A second core principle of any innovation strategy, and look, to be honest, any strategy in general, is that leadership is the key. Okay, at the end of the day, strategy is driven by a leader. Someone has to be the force within the organisation that shapes and drives that innovation. Now, certainly, we want to have input from different levels and different people within the organisation to that strategy. The more input we get from different people within that organisation, the more likely we are to get buy-in, that we are to get them to have some sort of stake in the strategy. But at the end of the day, when it comes to implementing that strategy and making the strategy happen, leadership becomes critical. So if an organisation is going to drive innovation strategy, then it needs to have the right leadership team in place. It needs to have people who are willing to take on the challenges of innovation and to be able to perceive and think of the world in different ways. A third principle is that any innovation strategy has to really focus on value for the customer. I think that organisations quite often lose sight of the customer being the end point of all their activities. And what we're doing as a business is trying to create value for the customer so that they're willing to buy our product. So whenever we're looking to innovate, whenever we're looking to drive change in the organisation, we need to have a real clear picture on how this innovation is going to provide value for the customer. Remember that a lot of innovations are driven by, for example, engineering solutions to problems. And while those problems might be neat and might be interesting, we've got to ask ourselves, are the customers actually willing to pay money for that particular service? So again, a very clear understanding on what our customers want, what they need, and how this innovation might drive value should really shape the types of innovation you undertake. Remembering too, you've got to be really clear there not only on who your current customers are, but any future or potential customers that the organisation might have. A fourth key principle of innovation is that we have to effectively manage risk and change. So if you think back to last week, we talked about Gladwell's article about risk and risk-taking behaviour. And what we sort of arrived at was that entrepreneurs do take risks, but they're calculated risks. And so they're people who are able to look at a situation of uncertainty, to deploy their resources effectively to deal with that uncertainty, and to come up with strategies that might take the organisation forward. So again, if an innovation is going to happen, we have to be able to deal with complexity, with uncertainty, with resource constraints, to effectively come up with a strategy for the organisation. And we have to be able to deal with change. Now, not everyone is comfortable with change. Change is quite threatening to individuals, particularly when you've built up an existing power structure within the organisation. And so unless an organisation and the individuals within it are willing to change, then no change is going to happen. We also need a fifth core principle is we need to understand that sustainable development does tend to stimulate innovation. Now we're talking here about the issue of environmental and social impacts that a business might have. And so one of the key areas that we can look for innovations, and one of the areas where new value and opportunities will come in the future, is very much looking at where organisations interface with the natural world and with the social world, and how our strategies might improve environmental conditions, or how we might improve the lot of people in a society living near and working with our business. And so again, appreciating that sustainable development principle and building it into our innovation strategy is important. A sixth principle is the notion that collaboration is usually effective. Again, there's a tendency to believe that all innovation is done secretively and is done in-house and without involvement of external stakeholders. But in fact, increasing volumes of innovation is actually being done in an open sense. And later in the semester, we're going to talk about open innovation and the benefits that open innovation might bring to an organisation or organisational context. So we need these internal and external collaborations. We need people working together if we're going to be able to drive innovation. And that collaboration, can again build organisational strength. We have limited resources. So by partnering and working with other organisations, we're able to access their resources and use those resources effectively in running our business. A seventh principle is this idea that people and talent can be a very powerful source in innovation. Remember that innovation is about ideas. It's about challenging concepts, challenging the context we operate in, and generating new ideas and new concepts that might take the organisation forward. And so it's really important that we manage the team that we have involved in the innovation process. We really need the right people. We need to think about their skills, their abilities to think creatively and differently about problems. And one of the best ways that we can do that is by actually building diverse teams. There is a tendency in organisations to want to get a sort of narrow band of employee type and only have people from one type of background work in the organisation. But the more we can build diversity into our staff pool, the more we can involve a diverse range of creative people in the solution to our problems, the more likely we are going to be to come up with an innovation. Another principle of innovation strategy is we need to find ways to leverage the supply chain for innovation. The supply chain is all those series of activities that goes from the point of raw materials all the way through to the point of consumption for the customer, and in some sense can even go beyond that if we're buying back waste products and integrating that back into our system. So we need to understand how we can use that supply chain to innovate. And a lot of times innovation doesn't just happen within one organisation in the supply chain, it actually happens across the supply chain. I've recently been doing some research in the agricultural industry, and what I found is that a lot of growers work very closely with freight companies and wholesalers to actually look at innovative ways of packaging products, packaging fruits and vegetables, so they don't get damaged during the transportation process. So that, you know, ability to work with the supply chain again helps drive innovation. Another issue is we need to really look at embedding innovation within the organisation's values. You know, innovation can't be seen as a bolt-on or something we do at an ad hoc basis. It actually has to be core to what we do as an organisation. If it's integrated within our culture, if we have value system within the organisation that says, hey, new ideas and new concepts are not a threat, they're a positive outcome for the organisation, then we're far more likely to be able to drive innovation in the future. We also need to ensure that innovation is robust or resilient. It's very easy in the context of innovation and entrepreneurial behaviour to take knocks, to be pushed back and to have people say no to you as an individual. If innovation is to happen, then there's got to be a robustness in that system. You've got to make sure that people really are able to contribute, are able to stay the distance, and that any innovation you develop actually stands up to the test of time. You know, it's no good to do something that's going to last for a very short period of time because you waste a lot of resources in developing that innovation. An 11th principle of innovation strategy is that quality often underpins innovation. The consumers are constantly looking for quality products, products that satisfy their needs, that are reliable and dependable. And we tend to see again that organisations who have very good quality processes in place find new and interesting ways to innovate. So for example, the lean management process that's used by many manufacturing organisations is a very good system for identifying ways to innovate, particularly in terms of processes and providing cost savings for the organisation. So again, building a quality culture within the organisation can be a very good way to also foster innovation. A 12th issue we need to think about is that, again, thinking of that BCG process, we can't just have one project underway at any one time. We need to have multiple projects. And what we need to do is have a mix of bread and butter projects, you know, projects that bring in small gains, small incremental changes, with projects that we'd call like jam-based projects, projects that are high value, that might lead to radical change within the organisation. I think there's often a focus in organisations on the jam aspect, you know, trying to do the things that are really valuable and really important, and overlooking the long-term gain that we can get from the bread and butter activities, the things that might bring long-term, sustained, incremental growth to the organisation. So again, you really need a balance. You don't want to have all of your eggs in the one innovation basket. The 13th principle is really linked to this idea that you've got to spend it to make it. Often people starve innovation because they will not invest in it. Because it's difficult to see what the potential payoffs might be, because there's a lot of risk associated with that. And we know that, you know, if we put money in other uses that will probably get a defined return, people are reluctant, senior managers are reluctant to make that investment. So if you want to harvest the benefits of innovation, you do have to spend money on innovation. And again, if you look at the companies that are really strong at driving innovation within their organisations, what they tend to do is invest very heavily in the innovation function. So they spend organisational time and money on doing that. So for example, companies like 3M spend about 5% of revenue on innovation. And final principle we need to think about is that when innovation is done in a systematic way, and when it's done well, it tends to work. And so organisations need to again have robust processes and policies in place for driving an innovation strategy. So that gives you a bit of an overview of what an innovation strategy is. As I said, the text does a really good job of explaining those things in a little bit more detail, so I'd encourage you to have a look at that. What I'm going to do in the final part of the lecture is talk about the notion of strategic entrepreneurship. Strategic entrepreneurship is a marrying up of entrepreneurial theory with the concept of strategic management.